Peace, alafia, shalom, assalamu alaikum. To know thyself is to know thy history. I am your host, the last griot, and in this episode, we will be telling the story of the former slaves who started their own country. Have you ever heard of the Americo Liberians? They are truly a people of determination, endurance, and faith. They are very similar to the Sierra Leonean Creole people I've discussed in my previous videos, and their stories are somewhat intertwined throughout the chapters of history. The Americo Liberians, also known as Congo people, are a Liberian ethnic group of African American, Afro-Caribbean, and liberated African descent. And just like the Sierra Leonean Creoles, they can also trace their ancestry to free-born and formerly enslaved African Americans, who emigrated in the 19th century to become the founders of the state of Liberia. The early African American settlers who arrived in that region that was established as Liberia between 1820 and 1843 were mainly free blacks from southern states such as Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Florida, while smaller numbers came from northern states like New Jersey, New York, Delaware, and Connecticut. A lot of settlements in Liberia were named after the cities and states that these former slaves had came from, or named after some of the black founders and their white supervisors of the migration. The Americo Liberians would settle in Monrovia, Carysburg, Clay Ashland, Buchanan, Maryland, Mississippi in Africa, Cape Mount, Greenville, and a number of small towns along the St. Paul River. The American Colonization Society would be major players in this resettlement and ultimately make Liberia the only country to be colonized by America. White Americans encouraged the emigration of people of color to Africa due to their opposition to integration. Additionally, some slave owners freed some of their slaves on the condition of them immigrating to Africa. The white Americans did not see any value in their slaves after slavery was abolished. They did not want to have to make any further provisions for them since it no longer benefited them. And they also had a subconscious fear of revenge by the formerly enslaved or the influence of free blacks on those who were still enslaved to rebel. These were all factors in the situation. Some African Americans opposed the migration because they sensed that the Americans had ulterior motives to their scheme hidden behind a mask of philanthropy. However, other African Americans believed they would face better economic opportunities in Africa and be free from the racial prejudice, a sentiment that was endorsed by the Back to Africa movement. Before the movement of the early and mid-1900s by black revolutionaries, the very first movement started in 1782 up to 1871, and the first points of return that would occur would be to Sierra Leone and Liberia. The Americo Liberians are closely related to the Sierra Leone Creole people, not only historically and culturally, but also ancestrally. The Sierra Leone Creole people formed through 4 waves of migration. For more details on this account, watch my playlist called the Sierra Leone series on my channel. There is a full video available, or you can watch it in 6 parts. The biggest wave of settlers stemmed from the liberated Africans. This wave would last from 1808 to 1871, and between this time, over 80,000 Africans were liberated and resettled. After 1807, any slaves illegally taken from the west coast of Africa and placed aboard ships that were en route to the Americas or Caribbean would be intercepted, and all slaves on board would be freed and resettled in Sierra Leone. Just like Sierra Leone, Liberia was formed through the former slaves who fought for their freedom and liberated Africans whose ships were intercepted and freed. In 1820, the American Colonization Society sent its first group of black immigrants to Chebro Island in Sierra Leone. The island's swampy, unhealthy conditions resulted in a high death rate among the settlers as well as the society's representatives. The British governor allowed the immigrants to relocate to a safer area temporarily, while the American Colonization Society worked to save its colonization project from complete disaster. In 1821, the American Colonization Society, or the ACS for short, dispatched a representative, Dr. Eli Ayres, to purchase land farther north of the coast of Sierra Leone, with the aid of U.S. naval officer Lieutenant Robert F. Stockton. Dr. Eli cruised the coastal waters west of the Grand Bassa, Liberia, seeking out appropriate lands for the colony. Stockton took charge of the negotiations with the leaders of the Dey and Bassa peoples who lived in the area of modern-day Cape Massarato in Liberia. At first, the local leaders were reluctant to surrender their people's land to the strangers, but were forcefully persuaded. Some accounts say it was at gunpoint, and say that the exchange would be a 36-mile long and 3-mile wide strip of coastal land from the native people in exchange for trade goods, supplies, weapons, and rum worth approximately $300 from the ACS. In 1822, the survivors settled in Chebro Island came to Cape Massarato and began to build their settlement. Some of the descendants of the black settlers who came to Sierra Leone from Nova Scotia in 1792 would join them as well. In 1827, slave states in North America, increasingly interested in getting rid of their free African American populations, encouraged the formation of colonization societies. These groups organized themselves independent from the ACS and founded their own colonies in Liberia for transporting free African Americans. Some of the quote-unquote volunteers were only freed if they agreed to emigrate. The Maryland State Colonization Society established its own colony in Cape Palmas, Liberia. Virginia and Mississippi also established Liberian colonies for former slaves and free blacks. In 1838, the Independent Virginia and Pennsylvania Society, as well as the larger American Colonization Society, all merged together to form the Commonwealth of Liberia and claim control over all settlements between Sestos River and Cape Mount. The Commonwealth adopted a new constitution and a newly appointed governor in 1839. The Mississippi settlement at the mouth of the Sino River would also join the Commonwealth in 1842. In 1847, Liberia declared independence from the American Colonization Society in order to establish a sovereign state and create its own laws governing commerce. At some point between 1840 and 1865, the next wave of settlers would be from 5,000 liberated Africans who were originally captives illegally taken from the Congo Basin. They would also be taken from places such as Nigeria, Cameroon, and Ghana, but were all described as Congos. Their slave ships would end up being intercepted by the British and Americans. The recaptives would be settled in Liberia, and this is why the Americo-Liberians are also known as the Congo people. In 1865, 346 Barbadians would also migrate to the new land that would become Liberia. From 1865 to 1930, there would also be a smaller number of Afro-Caribbean arrivals from islands such as Trinidad, Jamaica, and Grenada. The families who were originally from Barbados included the Barclays, Morgans, Best, Thorpes, Weeks, and Portmans, who settled in Crozierville. The fusion of African American, Caribbean, and Native Africans would form the Liberian culture and also give birth to the Liberian Creole, locally known as Colaqua. Another language would also emerge called Americo, which is related to Liberian Creole but also distinct in its own way. It has a heavier connection to the Gullah Geechee dialect from the African Americans who were enslaved in the low country of South Carolina. It also is influenced by Jamaican Patois and Bajan Creole from Barbados. Some Liberian accents have a Caribbean sound due to their ancestry, and many Liberians and Caribbean people intermarry today because of this familiarity. Americo-Liberians reproduced their own version of American culture in Liberia. The name Liberia means land of the free, and it is considered to be the most American African country in terms of political institutions. The Americo-Liberians introduced various aspects of African American culture in Liberia, including the traditional African American and Afro-Caribbean style of weddings, a unique form of antebellum architecture, and also introduced American baking techniques to the culinary cuisine of the region. The upper class and influential sect of the Americos were commonly known as members in the Masonic Lodge of Liberia, which was established in 1867. The Grand Masonic Lodge is located in Monrovia, the country's capital. Being a Mason was a veritable prerequisite for positions of political leadership in the true Whig Party. After Liberia's Declaration of Independence in 1847, the Americos controlled much of Liberia's political and social institutions. Liberia was initially dominated by two political parties that were supported by the Americos, the Republicans and the True Whig Party. After TWP candidate Anthony W. Gardner was elected president in 1878, the TWP went on to govern Liberia for over a century, cementing Americo-Liberian political dominance. While opposition parties were never made illegal and Liberia was not classed as a dictatorship, the TWP more or less ran the country as a one-state party and held a monopoly on Liberian politics. Liberian presidents from that day onwards were either of full or partial Americo-Liberian origin. During his rule, Americo-Liberian President William Tubman was widely regarded as the father of modern Liberia. The Tubman administration embarked on a mass modernization program, including improving literacy among the population, updating the nation's infrastructure, courting close relationships with the United States, and attracting foreign investment to stimulate the economy. William Tolbert attempted to introduce liberal reforms, including addressing imbalances between Americo-Liberians and the indigenous peoples by bringing in more native figures into the government. While the Americos felt undermined by this, there were also natives who felt the process of change was happening too slowly. So in 1980, a native Liberian named Samuel Doe led a coup that overthrew Tolbert and had him assassinated. Doe suspended the Constitution of Liberia, assumed the rank of general, and established a provisional military government, making himself head of state. Doe dissolved the PRC in 1984 and attempted to legitimize his regime with a new constitution and being elected president in the 1985 general election, which he won despite evidence of election fraud. He would become the first non-Americo-Liberian president, ending the Americos' 133-year reign over the country. Unlike their Liberian cousins, the Sierra Leone Creoles never gained any real political power as the country modernized, and their influence was always kept minimal to prevent the native or indigenous people from becoming second-class citizens in their own country. Even though today, the Creoles are just as much Sierra Leonean as the other ethnic groups, they are still treated as a minority with generational tension between them and other tribes, but at a significantly smaller degree compared to the colonial times. In Liberia, it was the complete opposite. The African American and Caribbean settlers were able to completely dominate the country and become the ruling political class for 133 years before being ousted. This is the story of the Americo-Liberians, the former slaves that started their own country. Please like, comment, and share, then hit the subscribe button to stay in tune for more content. Peace, love, and gratitude to everyone who tuned in. Thank you.